Hello again everybody and welcome back to Fujitsu Blitz, and today I'm going to do something slightly different. It still has a Blitz theme, but it actually isn't about Blitz. I'm going to look at some real stories, and the topic I've chosen first and foremost is the KV-1 tank and a chap called Zinovy Kolobanov, the man who gives the name to the Kolobanov medal. Why did I choose this? Well, for two reasons. One, not many people know about Zinovy Kolobanov, and a lot of people don't really know much about the KV-1 tank, oddly enough. So I decided to do a sort of mini history lesson on both. Now, we all know and love the KV-1. It's a Tier 5 Soviet heavy tank. But what a lot of people don't really know is that this was one of the mainstays of the Red Army during World War II. Now, not only that, but this was actually not a bad tank. It was named after this fellow, Kliment Voroshilov, who initially started out as a cavalry officer in the Red Army and worked his way up until he got a position as basically the defense commissar and a member of the Politburo, a very close friend of Joseph Stalin. He was also in charge of some big things like the defense of Leningrad, for example, and he had his hand in a lot of the major decisions that went on within the Soviet hierarchy during World War II. Now, prior to the war, he served as the People's Commissar for Defense. Then there he is there alongside Joseph Stalin. And when you're the People's Commissar for Defense, you get to basically pick weaponry like tanks. Now, the KV-1 came along in the late 1930s, funnily enough. Primarily because this tank, the T-35, was so bad. It really was a terrible tank, and as you can see there, it's got like multiple turrets, and it wasn't exactly a good tank. And there's a real one there that's actually in running order. So the Soviet army decided to basically get a better tank, and they put it out to tender. Two tanks were designed. Firstly, this one, which is called the SMK tank, which again is similar to the T-35 with the multiple turret. Little bit of a better armor. I mean, look at it. I mean, it's colossal. It is massive. And what we now know as the KV-1, which won the production. And there is a KV-1 right there. Now, the reason it was called the KV-1, it was the first tank designed, and because they actually won the order, they named it after the People's Commissar for Defense, Kliment Voroshilov. Hence the reason it's called KV. But don't forget, he was also a cavalry officer, so it sort of made sense to call it after him. Although originally it was meant to be called the Kontin Stalin. But that never really took off, and it was meant to actually be called the KS-1. Its real name, however, is Model 1939. Despite the fact they didn't actually roll off the Kirov tank line in Leningrad until 1940. Now, the thing about this tank was, it was actually far superior than anything the Germans could field at this point. And it was well ahead of its time. I mean, it had massively broad tracks, and it was very heavily armoured. In fact, the only tanks at this stage that had equivalent or better armour was the French B-1 Biz or the British Matilda II. I mean, this tank, realistically, was revolutionary in tank design. Not only that, for this period of time, it also had a fantastic gun. Although at first, due to delays in production, it actually had a pretty pants gun, which was the very short-barreled Al-11, which was a 76.2mm gun. It eventually, however, got the longer 76.2mm gun, which was also used on the T-34-76. Thing is, I mean, eventually it obviously went slightly obsolete, and towards the middle to the end of the war, it was pretty much outclassed by the bigger German heavies, which then gave rise to the IS, or Iosif Stalin series of tanks. And this was the predecessor, guys. I mean, the KV-1, okay, it morphed into the KV-1S, which was a smaller turret, but it morphed into the IS series, the IS-3, etc., etc. And there, in fact, is a KV-1S. That's a picture I took at the Kubinka Tank Museum. The thing about the KV-1, and forget the turret for the moment, because this is a KV-1S, for its time, as I said, it was pretty revolutionary. the tracks are really broad, which means it can actually go over quite a lot of soft ground, despite the fact it weighs 45 tons. The other thing was, if you notice, no rubber on the wheels. I mean, the road wheels, Russia was running out of rubber, or they had a lack of rubber, so they never used them. They just used steel on steel, which made the tank rather noisy. Now, the KV-1 itself stayed into production well into 1942. After that, in 1943, the Russians moved on to developing the KV-2, the KV-1S, and the Su-152. They also decided to upgrade the entire tank line into this tank, which looks like an IS, funnily enough, but this is actually the KV-85. Basically, it's the same series of KV. The difference being is, by this stage of the war, 1943, the Russians were struggling against the German tanks because of the Panthers and the Tigers, so they needed a bigger gun. So they used the 85mm that is on the T-34-85 and married it to this, a KV-1S chassis with what they called the IS-85 turret, mainly because of the gun. Now, whilst the gun was good, unfortunately the tank itself was pretty pants. It was very unreliable, mainly because of its chassis. And it eventually led to this tank, which is the IS-1, which we all know in the game. Now, getting back to the KV-1 itself. Now, this is the KV-1 at Bovington Tank Museum, looking rather fetching. In the words there say, "Yes, Leningrad." Unfortunately, that's all fake. The Tank Museum painted it that colour and put all those writings on it. This was actually given to the British as a sort of present by the Russians. It was sort of a test tank, and it never actually saw action, and it was never painted in this colour, and it never had that writing on the side. So, just to make it look good, I guess. But the thing about the KV-1, in my view, is that it's one of the unsung heroes of World War II. I mean, that's a KV-1 there, sporting Finnish camouflage. It's a captured Finnish tank, funnily enough. And the reason I say it's an unsung hero is because a lot of people focus on the T-34. And it's true to say, there are a lot more T-34s on the battlefield, and they're a lot more effective towards the latter part of the war than the KV-1. But don't underestimate this tank, guys. This tank was well ahead of its time. Okay, it had production problems. Okay, it was rushed into production, and it wasn't exactly as reliable as people think. But it had spectacular armour. It had those really broad tracks and that amazing torsion bar suspension. And for its time, it was spectacular. And there's one that's been knocked out. And it saw action in virtually all the major battles of World War II that the Soviets fought in. And it was at Kursk. And, it was operational right up until the end of the war, although in very limited numbers. One of the battles it did take part in, however, was in 1941, and it was called the Battle of Krasnogvardesk, which is part of the Battle of Leningrad, where the Germans pushed towards the port city, now known as St. Petersburg, then called Leningrad. Now, at this stage of the war, to be perfectly frank, the Russians were on the back foot. The Germans were advancing on a broad front across most of the Soviet Union, and the Russians were losing badly. They knew that Army Group North was pushing towards Leningrad. So the Russian High Command set up a very hasty defense. And instead of sending out lots of different tank armies left, right and center, they actually sent out units instead, very small units. And one of those units was commanded by this chap, Lieutenant Zinoviy Grigorevich Kolobanov, who commanded 5 KV-1s. That's right, you did hear me correctly. 5 KV-1s. Not hundreds, just 5. And what this man did was truly outstanding. He knew that remnants of the 6th and 1st Panzer Divisions were approaching a very small town called Krasnogvardesk, near Leningrad. And he was the only unit that could possibly engage them. The thing was, he already sort of knew the terrain, and he knew what he wanted to do. Basically, the terrain was a single track, and it was on the edge of a swamp. So he dug his tanks in. He basically just waited and effectively ambushed the Germans. Now, the Germans, buoyed up with their advance and their success at this stage, were pushing through the small town of Krasnogvardesk from 3 separate directions. But the thing is, the terrain really didn't suit them. Now, what Kolobanov did, he decided that he didn't want to show his hand. He knew that the Germans were going to come in along a particular route, so instead of giving away his strength, he ordered his tanks to attack one by one. So what happened then was the 6th Panzer Division's vanguard entered into the area, which was a very well prepared ambush by Kolobanov. Kolobanov's tank then engaged, and his gunner, a chap called Andrei Usov, managed to knock out the leading German tank with one shot. The Germans were completely bemused. They actually thought the tank had hit an anti-tank mine. They really weren't aware, and maybe they were slightly arrogant because, as I said, they'd been very successful in their attack up to date. They weren't aware that they could have been knocked out by a Soviet tank. This allowed Andrei Usov to then knock out a second German tank, which was somewhere in the column. The Germans were still completely bemused. So instead of taking evasive action, they just stopped. This then allowed Usov to target the trailing tank of the column and knock that out also. That in turn effectively boxed the entire column in. They couldn't go forward and they couldn't go backwards, allowing the Soviets easy pickings. Now, by now, the Germans weren't stupid enough to realize they weren't being attacked and these weren't anti-tank mines anymore. They knew they were being ambushed. Problem was, they couldn't see where they were being attacked from. So they decided to take a defensive action. And as I said earlier, the area was swampy, so they moved off the road, both left and right, and became bogged down effectively. They started firing blindly in the general direction of where they thought they were being attacked, namely towards Kolobanov. But they really didn't have a clue. By now they were bogged down, and this really made it easy for Kolobanov and his crew to engage them. And what he did next is outstanding. And whilst the Blitz medal gives you a nice little medal for standing alone against 3 tanks, Kolobanov and his tank crew, that's them there, did a hell of a lot more than taking out 3 tanks on their own. They actually took out 22 German tanks and 2 artillery pieces before they ran out of ammunition, basically. I mean, Kolobanov's tank ran out of ammunition. And the irony is, he'd ordered his tank crews earlier to double up on their ammunition, so they had double the amount of ammo. So Kolobanov had to then back away, and he ordered one of his other KV-1s, don't forget, there were only 5 of them, to move forward, and they took out another 21 German tanks before the battle actually finished. And the battle itself only lasted about 30 minutes. By that stage, they had knocked out 43 German tanks and effectively stopped the advance in that area. Now, Kolobanov's tank, number 864, accounted for 21 destroyed tanks alone. And his poor KV-1 had been hit 156 times by the German tanks and the various other pieces there. But they never once got penetrated. That goes to show the true testament of the armor on a KV-1. And this is why I said earlier the KV-1 was revolutionary. Kolobanov himself was highly decorated. He received the Order of the Red Banner for his defense, and his gunner, Andrei Usov, was awarded the Order of Lenin. He went on, he survived the war, although he was severely wounded in a place called Pushkin in Leningrad, and he did, to be fair, spend the rest of the war, well, most of the rest of the war, in hospital. Nevertheless, he passed away in 1994. There have been numerous monuments dedicated to him. One monument was dedicated in 1980 on the actual spot where his KV-1 took part in this action. Unfortunately, however, they couldn't find a suitable KV-1 to stick there, so they stuck an IS-2 instead. And then in 2006, they unveiled another monument to him in Minsk, the capital of Belarus. And as we know, Wargaming have also honoured him with this medal, the Kolobanov. This is a medal awarded when you stand alone against 3 tanks, which, whilst it's a fantastic medal and a great achievement, doesn't really highlight what Zinovy Kolobanov and his crew did on that day in 1941. I think it's fair to say that Zinovy Kolobanov is a true Soviet tank ace. Not well known, unfortunately, and that's a shame because he should be. And it goes to highlight that the KV-1 was indeed a formidable tank. Anyway, I've been Fujit. I know this is a little bit different, but I hope it's been enjoyable, educational, and highlighted some things that maybe you did or didn't know. By all means, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. I intend to do more of these videos. By the way, they're not political. I'm not doing them for any agenda. I'm not saying that this force is better than that force, etc., etc. I'm just talking about real tanks and some real stories behind those tanks. By all means, comment, like, etc. below. And until the next time, guys, stay safe out there. Have fun on the pixelated battlefield, and happy tanking. If you play Blitz, of course. If you don't, just stay safe out there and have fun. And until the next time, when we'll do another one of these, I shall say, das Vidania.